Join me as I continue to expand the science fantasy world that I've been developing through the crafting of handmade dioramas. I'll walk you through the process of kitbashing a fantastical walking mech diorama using Gundam kits and DIY techniques. Then I'll tell you a short story based on this homebrew world. This is Horizons.forge, and it's time to answer the call. Apparently, I really like walkers and mechs, as I literally have dozens of them on my shelves. I had a lot of fun going through all of these and finding parts that I liked and aesthetics that were interesting to me. I found this cool model online, and even though it kind of had the aesthetic that I was looking for, I didn't think that it'd be a whole lot of fun to kind of just print a model and call it done. So I'm gonna make my own. I had every intention of using these Gunpla kits as intended, but it turns out they have other uses. I spent a lot of time looking through each piece to see what would fit the mechanics and my growing vision for the world. It also made sense to me to print off some 3D kitbash bits to add some extra texture. Finally, no kitbash is complete without some styrene products. The legs seemed like a logical first step for a walker mech thing, as they would be the basis for the whole model, really. I used a lot of parts that were actually designed to fit together for the basic, let's call it a frame, for the model. From there was a process of holding parts up to each piece to see what worked and what needed modifications. I won't go into every detail of this process, because there really was no process. If I felt something needed to be added to make it bulkier, I did it. If something needed to be cut away to make it fit, I did that too. I mostly used the styrene as added bulk and size to give glue and other pieces more surface area with which to hold together. One thing I would like to do in the future is to create custom panels with styrene, which would save me a lot of money on Gunpla pieces, because I did use a lot on this build. It was very important for me to create legs and arms that could be posable at the end of the process, so that it could have a realistic standing position. I partially succeeded at this. Glue tends to get everywhere and some of the joints got kind of stuck, so it wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough. One of the things that worked best for me was using metal and eventually 3D printed spheres to create ball joints. Once the frames were done, the fun part started, adding tons of greeble and detail to each of the legs. The hardest part about this was finding enough pieces that I had multiples of so that the legs could be mirrored. This isn't totally a deal breaker for everything, but for the aesthetic of the region for this short story, I wanted everything to be a little bit more precise. We're going to learn a little bit more about this particular mech and its pilot later on in the video. I did very little custom work on each piece here in the beginning, as I was just starting to get my bearings really, but eventually became brave enough to start hacking away at some plastic. Eagle-eyed Gunpla builders will likely be able to pinpoint each piece, which is something I'm actually going to try to avoid in the future. I want to continue to develop the aesthetic for the magical machinery of each region, without delving too far into the science side of the story across the whole continent. But for this area, it fits. The waist was actually one of the easiest pieces to put together, and also the smallest. It was effectively a rigid piece with 3 ball joints that needed to be given some more bulk. Using some styrene here, I created a connector of sorts to glue together 2 pieces that had no real tooth to grab onto. This actually helped to lengthen the whole piece, so I could put the 3rd ball joint further ahead for the cockpit to sit away from the legs a bit. I wanted it to actually have that hunched over RoboCop ED-209 look, and this helped me get there. You can see the ball joints are just 3D printed spheres. I ended up printing dozens of multiple different sizes to use on this and future builds. One thing I intend to do is to 3D sculpt this sort of agnostic ball joint mechanism that can be resized and printed to fit any number of robot styles. It was at this point that the mess on my desk had begun to drive me crazy, so I printed some desk organizers to keep everything in check. Now that I am no longer going mad, I can get back to piecing everything together, including the carriage for that third ball joint that I mentioned previously. I used an excessive amount of glue here as I don't want these connection points to be brittle in any way. Then I sprayed it with super glue accelerator, which actually makes the glue insanely hot, so be careful if you ever intend to use any of that stuff. After adding some pipes as vents and some additional greeble, it was time to move on to my least favorite part of the build. The torso or cockpit of the mech did not turn out how I wanted it at all, but I wouldn't exactly call it a failure. I learned a lot here and have something better to strive for next time. I also happen to lose a lot of the footage here, so I'm mostly just explaining how I will correct this in the future. I think my biggest blunder here was not using a large enough base to build from. I had no shape or structure as inspiration. I just kept adding pieces on top of each other to make it bigger. Next time, a big chunk of plastic like from, say, a water gun from the dollar store or something like that would work much better. With that being said, I think I ended up with a cool but still awkwardly small piece. The arms, effectively the weapons, were the fastest part to come together of the whole build, and really was the amalgamation of the things I learned from each step prior. I was able to determine when to adjust a piece, I could quickly determine what did and did not work, and finally I was able to perceive what I wanted and customize to my needs quickly. For instance, I copied the shape of this piece in Blender to make multiple copies for other joints, such as this ball joint with a flattened side to attach the arms. Here's a fun piece of customization that I would actually like to do more of in the future, creating custom shapes out of plastic styrene sheets, which are very easy to score with the blade, snap, and then shape by sanding or even melting. They also adhere to other plastic pieces via plastic cement, which makes it a very versatile product. This process is called adding greeble, which is a term popularized in I think the 70s or 80s to describe the jagged, haphazard look of the surfaces of Imperial Star Destroyers and other ships in the Star Wars franchise. And here we are, all the basic segments of my walker, all ready for assembly, after just one more step. The model did have some fairly egregious gaps and holes that I wanted to fill in, so I mixed up a 2-part putty epoxy called Milliput in order to fill them up. This creates a more seamless transition and fills in spaces in a much cheaper way than using more bits would. Could have done a bit better here, but I didn't notice the mistakes and the lack of smoothness until the priming stage. Milliput dries very hard and can be easily sanded, which I did do some of, but for the future I would probably cover these larger Milliput areas with another flat bit or styrene of some kind. The region in which this particular story takes place in is a flat grassland type area, so I wanted to make a more simple base, especially considering the amount of effort I've already put into the project. I started with a basic wood canvas and topped it with my usual layer of XPS insulation foam. I don't always need this layer of foam, I did this time, but I always add it in case I need to carve into something or I need more depth for whatever reason. When using my hot wire cutter, I always have the base on the bottom. It makes it harder to see past the foam, but the wire bends less, making for a straighter edge. Because I used a wood base this time, and actually I think for the first time, I thought I would mask it off so I could stain it later. Hopefully this works. Foreshadowing? I don't know, stay and watch. I used the hero model of the piece to give myself an idea of where I want a small overlook to be. then start carving into the pink stuff. But not before attaching a fresh blade. The sharper your knife is, the safer you actually are, but you also want to make sure you don't just throw the old blade right in the trash. That is not safe. I decided this time to, instead of an additive process of gluing new foam down, that I would go subtractive and get the shape I was after. This part took forever with the knife, so eventually after all the cutting, the scoring, and tearing away at the dense foam with my bare hands, I just gave up and pulled out my handheld hot wire cutter to finish the job. Like I said, this is a smooth grassland plane, so I wanted to keep things more even. Using the knife, I added some striations into the walls of the overlook to add some texture. I went more sparing with this than usual. Then I dropped down some of the good old plaster rocks I've been using in most of my videos. I actually want to try using bark or wood in the future, but I need to get my hands on the right stuff for it. I mixed up more of that plaster I used to make those rocks, glue, and paint to make a texture paste, and coated it all over the flat surfaces. I've given up trying to make this look nice on camera, so I just decided to slap it down and spread it out with my hands. I wanted to save myself some time and effort by premixing a base of flocking rocks and other materials. I didn't actually have a plan with this, I just knew I wanted to use all of the things that I normally use all at once, so I just started pouring everything from coarse flocking to actual dirt into a container. I was pretty happy with the mixture as a base layer, and I think with some refinement of materials and ratios, I could make a few different pre-made mixes like this that can really speed up the process of flocking specific biomes like this. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you know that when I do natural surfaces like this, I tend to make tons of layers of product. So this would never replace that strategy, but could make things smoother and more consistent in the future. Like usual, just a layer of glue, lay everything down, and then spray with isopropyl alcohol. Wait a minute. Looks like I forgot to do some painting. Oh well. Anyway, spray some isopropyl alcohol and very watered down Mod Podge to seal it all in. And then I carefully painted those rocks I completely forgot about in my excitement. So, while I finish the last few steps and then assemble everything, let's dive into a short story. In the twilight of his youth, Renar Valteris, much like many other sons of the Ishvaran Dominion, found himself conscripted into the Imperial Army. Luckily for Renar, he was gifted with a natural aptitude and a spirit untamed. He soared through the ranks of the Arcanomech division of the Dominion's army. His aspirations set skyward with dreams of becoming a legend among the Storm Riders, the most legendary and elite pilots within this division. To him, these metallic behemoths weren't just machines but vessels of his own destiny. Conduits for his ambitions to carve a path of heroism through the annals of history. But the naivety of his dream was shattered amidst the cacophony of his first battle, where the grim realities of war unveiled their gruesome visage. The Alafo coast bore witness to Renar's baptism of fire as he fought to seize a port city crucial to the Dominion's strategic ambitions. The horrors of his first battle will leave Renar a changed man. 10 years, almost to the day, Renar awakens in his familiar cold chamber. The brutalist stone architecture, an homage to the blunt harshness of the only world he's ever known. But this was not his home. His home was within the cockpit of his trusty Arcanomech, standard issue for the military pilots, but it belonged to him, at least until today. Today he begins a new mission and will take the reins of a new, experimental mech that he was told very little about. After being given his strange, vague instructions from his commanding officer, he made his way to the mech hangar, where he would meet his new companion, as it were. As he stepped into the hangar, he was in awe of the machine in front of him. In stark contrast to the standard mechs he was familiar with, this particular machine was beautiful and alien in ways he could not describe. He immediately began to review the differences between this and previous models. Longer arms and legs, shorter weapons, a much slimmer frame. This was an agile mech made for close combat. The cockpit, he thought, though, was a bit too small. How would he be able to see around him and maneuver? The only way to see out appeared to be through two glass baubles positioned directly on the front of the mech. How am I supposed to be able to see anything? He said quietly to himself. A pretentious voice rang out from behind him, startling him. He had been so preoccupied with the machine in front of him that he didn't even think to acknowledge that there might be others here. Once we finish the interfacing process, you won't need to see. Strange words from a strange man. The voice came from Edgar Hawthorne, one of the head tech weavers, and, from what he understood, the creator of his new mech. We call it Ghost Strike, designation GS-043, designed in such a way that it allows for seamless integration between itself and the pilot. Strange name for such a vividly colored piece of tech, Renard said coldly, referring to the bright crimson of the panels. Not my first choice of color either, I assure you, but I follow orders just like yourself. The interfacing will begin automatically. Edgar continued on after this, but Renard didn't care much to listen. While cold on the outside, he was brimming with curiosity and excitement on the inside. There was a familiarity in the cockpit. It was made by the same creators as his previous machines, of course, but this felt different. As he put his hands on the joysticks, he felt a sharp pain under his glove, right in the palm of his hand. He witnessed a small needle retract from the grip and enter the console. Did that thing just take my blood? He thought to himself. Just as he began to feel anxious, he pushed his emotions to the side and the machine started up on its own. As he exited the hangar with his experimental mech, he felt as if there was something odd happening to him. There was a buzzing in his head and a light tingling sensation throughout his entire body. It didn't feel bad, nor did it feel particularly good. In fact, it felt very natural, like you should have always felt this feeling to begin with. He was headed into enemy territory, but he was instructed not to engage, only to pass through South Telomere undetected, in order to reach an encampment within Ishalakor, a dig site where Ishvaran tech weavers found something important. He was told to provide them with extra protection while testing the new interface within Ghost Strike. Edgar was right. As he continued his travels, he found himself not needing to peer through the periscope to see through the glass lens. He could feel the world around him, and it was magnificent. In stark contrast to the cold, brutalist nature of the Ishvaran lands he was familiar with, these lands were lush with beautiful colors. A verdant sea of grass and flowers, flora and fauna that flourished and thrived, not beaten down by the advent of industrialism. Of course the land was untouched. The Telomere have mastered the skies. They built grand cities in the clouds and soared the skies on magically propelled airships. What did they need to be on the ground for? The world thrives beneath them as they live in luxury far away from anguish and pain. Like him. He felt the walker slow down to a near crawl. He felt himself slow down. He approached a bloom of crimson flowers, so very out of place within this lush land of green and gold. Then he thought, it looks just as out of place as I do. The access panel, his only way in and out of the mech, began to open, and he instinctively crawled through and rappelled down to investigate this bloom of flowers further. He felt so very out of place, not only in this serene land, but outside of Ghost Strike. It felt unnatural. He reached down to pick a flower, though he didn't know why. As he plucked a single flower from the ground, he felt a prick on his finger. A thorn pierced his glove, and he could feel the blood welling inside. As he raised his hand to investigate, the soulless machine raised its own, mirroring his own actions with eerie precision. In that moment, amidst the whispers of wind and the rustle of leaves, Renard glimpsed a truth hidden beneath layers of steel and circuitry. There was something happening to him that he could not explain, and as he stared into the glass lenses, he thought to himself, which one of us is truly without a soul? As always, thank you to everyone for sticking it out with me and following me on my storytelling journey. It means so much to me that you're here and continue to watch my videos. Please remember to like, subscribe, and check out all the links in my description below to stay up to date. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.